Welcome and thank you for joining us on the third and the last session of the Oxford Business Law Block Annual Conference, jointly hosted by ECGI, Oxford University Law School, University of Hamburg, and Free University of Berlin, and last but not least, the National University of Singapore, Faculty of Law. I'm Luh Luh Lan from the National University of Singapore, and I'll be your host for this session. To recap, on day one in Oxford, we look at climate change disclosures and net zero commitments and heard the interesting papers presented by Eric Taylor and John Armour. On day two in Germany, we moved from firm level analysis to what the role of shareholders that they can play in climate change. We were treated to Oliver Hart's presentation on whether exit or voice is more powerful when it comes to climate change issues. We also heard from a panel of distinguished speakers discussing on the topic. Today, at the National University of Singapore, we would like to switch our focus to look at climate change in the boardroom. We all know that the board of directors is often called the directing mind and will of a company. However, when it comes to climate-related issues, how effective are the corporate and security law tools in shaping corporate behavior, especially those at the top? We will be hearing more on this topic from our presenter, our discussant, and our panelists today. So before I introduce our presenter today, for the attendees of the conference, again, we would like to hear from you, and so please use the chat function. A reminder for you is for you to address your questions to all the attendees and not just to the panelists, so that your question will be visible to all. Again, we will try to answer as many questions raised as possible, but judging from the last two sessions, I think those of you who has been with us last 2 days, due to the shortage of time and the overwhelming response, we may be only able to pick a few to answer. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter today. To kick off the discussion is Professor Brett McDonnell, Dorsey and Whitney Chair in Law, University of Minnesota Law School. He'll be presenting his paper entitled Green Boardrooms, which is co-written with Harry Osofsky, Jacqueline Peel, and Anita Foster. The discussant will be Martin Gelter, Professor of Law, Fordham University of Law, and a member of ECGI. Without further ado, I will now turn the time over to Brett.
Thank you, Lulu, and thank you to all of the organizers for inviting me to be part of this. Given the great presenters and other panelists, it's an honor and a little bit intimidating. So I'm presenting a paper that should be published any day now. There are 4 of us. I am the one business law professor in the group. The other 3 are all environmental law professors. 2 of us, me and Hari, are from the US, and 2 are from Australia. We come all at this from somewhat different perspectives, but ultimately concerned about what is going on over in recent years in using various corporate and securities law tools like disclosure, shareholder engagement, and fiduciary duty to try to induce companies to transition and respond better to climate change. So what I'm going to do, sort of outline with the talk in the paper, spend a few minutes talking about the sort of different backgrounds we bring to this while we're interested in the topic and how we're approaching trying to get a handle on what's going on, which is essentially we've been talking to several dozen people in the industry involved in these activities. Then I'll sort of briefly describe what we have found in those discussions in each of the 3 different tools we're focusing on: disclosure, shareholder engagement, and fiduciary duty. And then I'll finish up, hopefully, if there is time, talking a little bit of our suggestions for reforms going forward. So first, looking at framing this within corporate law and environmental law debates and discussion. Within corporate law, the movement in responding to climate change is part of a sort of broader movement sometimes called corporate social responsibility, sustainability, ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiatives, all of which are part of the long-running discussion of how can and should we get corporations to sort of respond to social problems. And there are, as you look at the sort of positions within this debate among both scholars and practitioners, there's sort of three positions. What we see as the sort of the core positions that we see in the people we talk to actually participating in this on how they describe and justify what they're doing is a focus on long-term shareholder value. And that is the position that responding significantly to climate change makes sense for most corporations now as a matter of both current market opportunities and challenges, current regulations, but also possible future regulation, and also reputational concerns, attracting employees, attracting customers. When you take long-term value into account, responding to climate change is actually a profitable endeavor. But there is criticism of that from sort of two different sides. There's sort of the traditional Milton Friedman anti-corporate social responsibility provision that says that maximizing profits is the sole legitimate purpose of corporations, and that much of what is being justified as shareholder value now is really sort of illicitly bringing in political preferences that are seen as illegitimate for corporations or as managers trying to avoid accountability. So that's one criticism of the movement from one side. And from another side, there is a criticism that even a focus on shareholder value in the traditional framework of at least US and Australian corporate and securities law is too weak. And you need a stronger focus on other kinds of stakeholders, including the environment, if you are going to get the real kind of change that's needed. So that's sort of the debate within the corporate governance world. For my colleagues as environmental law scholars, they're doing this because honestly, they're frustrated with what's going on in politics in terms of getting more environmental law focused regulation. That's clearly the main way you would think about addressing this as a legal matter. But things are stymied in both the US and to some extent in Australia as well. So they see that there's this stuff going on in the corporate sphere, and they see that as a way of at least trying to get some important work being done outside of the traditional political world. Not the only strategy, but an important one. But within the environmental world as well, there's some controversy around that. There's some people on the environmental side who see corporations as the enemy, and you need just strong legal regulation. You can't rely on corporations, thereby somewhat mimicking the Friedman position from a different side of politics. And there are other people who say, yeah, we do need corporations to work on this, but they need to be reformed with a much more of a focus on sustainability. So we're addressing that from different perspectives. Two more things about our methodology. One, it is a comparative methodology, in that we're looking at both the US and Australia. In part, that's just where we come from and what we're interested in, but also there are two relatively similar countries with relatively similar legal frameworks, but with some difference in some important elements relative to all this, so we can compare and contrast how they are doing. And then finally, the way in which we're trying to get at what's going on beyond reviewing the literature is interviews that we have done with participants, 14 in the US, 24 in Australia. These interviews were conducted in 2018. This is a fast-moving area, so they're already getting a little dated, but I think they're still relevant. We talked to people on both the company side, mostly officers, some directors, working on these kinds of issues. We also talked to people on the investor sides from a variety of different kinds of investment companies, talked to a few regulators in Australia, a few lawyers, a few people from various associations working on these issues. There are obvious problems with an interview methodology. We're only talking to a few dozen people. It can't be fully representative. You can't be sure that people are telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But we think it's one among a variety of ways of trying to get a handle, sort of one's part of the elephant in that traditional metaphor for what's going on. So without further ado, let me give a summary of what we have found in talking to people on the three major tools of corporate law we have been looking at. We looked at disclosure, which there's a variety of ways in which disclosure could ultimately change the behavior of businesses. Disclosure could be used by investors and other persons like employees or consumers as a way to divest or not become involved in businesses that aren't doing a good job, or to become involved in businesses that are. It can be used by shareholders or other stakeholders in the engagement process, or another pathway in which it could have an impact is the very process of gathering information will inform and change the understanding and culture and priorities of the people, the officers, the employees, the directors involved in that process of doing the disclosure. And that's an important pathway as well. So in terms of a bit of the legal background in this area, in both the US and Australia, there is in the corporate and securities law area, very limited mandatory disclosure on climate change or more generally on environmental issues. There's a 2010 guidance from the SEC in the US that gives some sense of where you might have to disclose that given the general securities law framework in the United States. With the advent of the Biden administration, there's being a lot of attention focused by the SEC on this area. They're taking public comments. They're doing audits of what companies are doing. I would expect this to be an area where we may see some regulation over the next few years. But as of now, there's very limited mandatory legal required disclosure. There is, on the other hand, a proliferation of private standards of disclosure. You see most large public companies now do annual sustainability reports or something like that. And they adopt various disclosure standards that have been set up by different groups. There are all sorts of acronyms if you follow this area, specifically on climate change. There's CDP and TCFD. There's also some more general standards aimed at a lot of different areas of sustainability, GRI, SASB. There's private raters. Rating agencies. There's a lot going on in terms of private standards of disclosures. In terms of what we found in our interviews, we saw there's a lot going on in this area, sort of wide agreement there, agreement that it's changing rapidly, that there's been a large expansion of disclosure. Many more companies are doing more than they used to. The quality of the disclosure has improved, but it remains highly variable, highly inconsistent, of highly mixed quality. The fact that there are all these different standards all there and no one has to follow any one of them makes it hard to compare across companies. It makes it pretty easy for companies to just reveal what they feel like revealing. The people on the investor side told us it's improving, but it has a long ways to go. And interestingly, even on the company side, people were telling us, we have all these demands, we're trying to meet this demand for disclosure, but there's so many different ways of doing it. It would actually be nice if we could agree on one standard, which gives us some sense that there may be, even on the company side, some support for at least a modest mandated standard to get some consistency on that. In talking to people, they tell us that it's not just investors, it's also people like customers and employees who are targets of this disclosure. The one company side person who was able to point to disclosure having a real direct impact on what they've done, it was through the impact on their customers who were asking for a certain thing in one area that they were disclosing. On the bottom line, in all of this, as we talk to people, we're trying to get a sense of both what's going on, how things have changed, how they and their clients are responding to things. We're trying to get at the bottom line of do you have a sense of, has this yet, or is it on the way to changing how companies really behave in responding to climate change, either in adapting to climate change or changing the type of energy they are using and helping the transition to clean energy? And look, it's hard to get a real answer to this. A lot of different stuff's going on. It's hard to separate out the impact of disclosure, shareholder engagement, or fiduciary duty from other things that are going on. But in general, on this and the other two items we'll be talking about, none of our participants were really able to point to anything clearly and saying, yeah, so far already we're seeing significant changes in how companies are doing things based on the type of disclosure that's going on now. No one could really point to much and say, yeah, this is having a big effect so far. Nonetheless, I would say there was a difference in attitude between people on the company side and on the investor side here. On the company side, the attitude was basically, you know what, we do a really good job already. I don't know if I believe that totally, but that's what they say. And all the disclosure is helping us tell a better story about what we are already doing. Whereas people on the investor side think that disclosure can make a difference to the extent that it becomes specific, quantitative, and targeted. That is, companies are setting out ambitious targets about what they want to do, quantitative targets, setting out, here's what we plan to do over the next 5 or 10 years. Once you have disclosure like that in place, they think it really will, companies will really want to look good. Once they've set targets like that, it really will change their agenda. It will change their internal culture. And as the disclosure, it's not there yet, but as it gets closer to being like that, they think it will change things. Similar results in Australia, similar range of quantity. The biggest difference in this area that we saw in the Australian interviews is that in the US, there are all these different standards and really not much sense of which one is prevailing. We saw a little more of a consensus on a move towards TCFD in the climate change area in Australia. And we talk a bit about shareholder engagement. This can be both formal engagement through the Rule 14A8 shareholder proposal process in the US public companies. Shareholders, if they hold enough shares, can propose a non-binding proposal to be voted on by other shareholders. There have been a proliferation of these in a lot of different areas, but especially in climate change in the last 5 or 10 years. There's that formal process. There's also an informal process, which is becoming increasingly common, of meeting with shareholders, meeting with people, directors, officers in companies to talk about this areas. There's been proliferation of all of this. There's a variety of different kinds of actors on the investor side, which I will skip over in the interest of times. There've been some important legal developments in recent years. Under the Trump administration, there were some legal obstacles that were put in place. In Rule 14.8, there are limits on how many. It became a little harder to propose shareholders because you had to have held more shares for a longer period of time. Also, a company can ask for the SEC that it not have to include a proposal for various reasons, and the way in which the ordinary business exclusion was interpreted under the Trump administration made it easier to exclude precisely those disclosure on targets that you want to meet that was seen as micromanaging. And also many investors in the US are subject to the laws of ERISA, which have strict fiduciary duty rule in climates. And there's sort of been a back and forth for a while now between Republican and Democratic administrations, with Republicans saying you have to focus exclusively on profit maximization, and we're going to make it really hard for you to argue that things like climate change have an impact on that. You really have to show that it does before you can use it. Democratic presidents have said, yeah, you have to process on getting the best return, but we're going to be relatively lenient in if you want to argue that climate change will have an impact. There's early signs that the Biden administration will move in that direction, but we'll see. In our interviews, we saw, again, there's been this big growth in engagement of various kinds, various type of proposals. I'll talk a little bit at the end about some that we suggest, but again, limited effects so far in this area. There's a bit more difference in Australia than in the US here. On the one hand, they have a longer tradition of informal engagement because they have a smaller number of large investors. The US institutional ownership is moving in that direction. On the other hand, they don't have the Rule 14.8 non-binding proposal process, and the Australians were telling us that they'd actually like to see some move in that direction. Finally, fiduciary duty, understanding of fiduciary duty, potentially using fiduciary duty suits if you're saying the company's not doing enough to respond to climate change. This is an area where my colleagues keep saying, oh, isn't this a tool? Couldn't we really use this? I was telling you, yeah, look, in the United States, we've got the business judgment rule. The one area where you might try to do something is a Caremark case where you say you haven't correctly overseen compliance with the law in environmental law areas. But that's extremely difficult to prevail. Although in the last couple of years, there's been a little change in the Caremark case law that opens just a wee little hint of daylight where you might be able to do something. In our interviews, we see threat of suits not having much impact yet because there isn't much of a threat yet. The understanding of fiduciary duty is evolving. Much change in how the board and officer structures are done to deal with climate change. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. Some trend towards looking for climate change expertise at the board level. Australia, interestingly enough, and this surprised me, there was more of a sense that this legal compliance oversight Caremark type duty might have some traction in Australia. There's one case against a superannuation fund that was recently settled. So it seems like the legal potential's more there. Okay, I'm basically out of time. Let me just say a word or two about reform. We basically found some support for sort of all the basic corporate governance positions. On the one hand, look, ultimately, we don't think so far, none of this is having a big effect. And ultimately, we think if you really want legal change, it needs to be in other areas of the law, not here. On the other hand, we do think there is some potential for improvement as these trends evolve. We got some evidence of what would be helpful to make these things have some greater impact. And given the problems on the political side, it's worth doing that. We actually think a sort of strong, more stakeholder focus, giving more empowerment to stakeholders would really be the way to go. That would be more powerful. And so our reforms in the paper make some suggestions along those lines. We also don't think there's any way that's happening in the US anytime soon. So we have more modest reforms that are based on the sort of traditional American approach of a focus on shareholders. So in disclosure, that would include potentially the SEC adopting regulations like perhaps SASB or one of the other are based on one of the existing frameworks that could be done within the existing securities law statutory framework, and we think it would be helpful. It wouldn't be as good as a really robust disclosure that was focused on other stakeholders as well as shareholders, but it would still be helpful, and it would be helpful to other stakeholders, not just shareholders. On the engagement side, we would love strong stakeholder empowerment of other stakeholders, advisory councils or people on the board, but more limitedly, rolling back the Trump rules, allowing for more shareholder engagement is eminently doable. And we have suggestions on shareholder proposals like better disclosure proposals, executive compensation tied to climate change metrics, director expertise on the board, advisory councils, stakeholder advisory councils are things that can be done. On the duty side, I probably in the US will watch for a while and see if other countries like Australia have developed some interesting case law in this area. Perhaps we might see a Caremark claim in this area. Someone try, a little bit of chance, but not a whole lot as it seems right now, given Delaware law. Let me stop there. I'm very interested in seeing what Martin and others have to say.
So thanks to the OBLB editors for having me at the conference and specifically for having me comment on this very interesting paper, which is really thoughtful and raises a lot of interesting questions. So I'm not really an expert on climate change, but I thought the paper raises many interesting questions for corporate governance, corporate theory, stakeholder theory, and comparative corporate governance. And since Brett did a great job on discussing the interview findings, I think I'll emphasize mainly these issues to from a somewhat idiosyncratic perspective, of course. So the paper asks what, in a nutshell, what role can corporate and securities law play for climate change? The authors performed interviews in the US and Australia about how the interviewees saw the impact of these I would say three aspects of these fields on corporations: disclosure obligations, shareholder activism, and fiduciary duty laws. So that paper is extremely timely today, actually at this very day, right? Because of recent events at ExxonMobil yesterday, with activists succeeding in putting some of their candidates on their board, and the Shell case in the Netherlands, where a court ordered the company to reduce its emissions. So let's see how that will hold up on appeal. So that's going to be really exciting. So the paper ends with some normative lessons, mainly for the US from Australia. But I would, I think, like to focus on a number of, take this a little bit broader to sort of a comparative corporate governance dimension as well. So the largest conceptual issue in the paper that I see is how it talks about the shareholder stakeholder debate early on. And the authors in the final part say they would like to see an aggressive stakeholder approach implemented, apparently with a mandatory stakeholder voice, but they say this is politically not realistic, with which I agree. The difficulty I have here with some of this is that it's not made very clear what exactly is meant by a stakeholder, and that could be a question or an issue. I mean, I've usually thought of stakeholders of groups of people with a position, a long-term relationship with a firm, maybe with a specific investment that's sort of like some employees that puts them into a similar position as residual claimants, as shareholders are. But we could take a broader perspective, and that makes things more complicated because the interests of various types of stakeholders are, of course, not aligned, and they're not necessarily aligned with climate change issues. One might think about, for instance, whether employees might not sometimes benefit from a company polluting, at least in the short run, or if you think about, for instance, the Volkswagen emissions cheating scandal, these pre-scandal, I would suspect that it wasn't a bad place for employees, for example, if you think that as a stakeholder. One issue is, of course, and I think this is something the authors would like to see, is some kind of environmentalist representation on the board. Although they recognize it probably won't happen, maybe analogous to employee co-determination on boards of directors. I kind of worry a little bit that would make decision-making structures yet more complex. So especially if we think about countries, jurisdictions that have employee directors or that have multiple large shareholders coalitions, often that represent different groups, which would increase complexity of decision-making. So ultimately, I think the advisory board model is more realistic, at least for large firms. Then if the big question about stakeholderism, of course, is when we go through this throughout history, starting with, early writings, for instance, in Germany by Walter Rathenau, the Burley Dart debate, and, the Gospel of Milton, which is a term from Brett's paper, which I love, is what it does to discretion on the board, right? In all these debates, we really, what is really underlying the shareholder stakeholder debate is a debate between managers who want to preserve their discretion, or people who think that managers should have a lot of discretion, and people who think that they are constrained. So, for instance, Bratton and Wacht's reading of the Burley-Dart debate basically says, because of the political vantage points, what Burley wanted was really to constrain managers, and Dodd was sort of trying to defend their discretion. And we see the same in Milton Friedman and elsewhere. So the question then, I think, becomes is how is that discretion that managers have, that boards have shaped, right? To some extent, it is shaped by corporate law, but I think what is even more important is the social, the political context that they are facing. So that concerns, for example, labor relations, right? How much are boards, how much are firms concerned with interacting with employees, how much do they have to cater to any particular stakeholder group's interests, and what ownership structures do firms have. Do we have a concentrated ownership structure in a particular firm, a dispersed one? What is the ownership of institutional and retail shareholders across countries over time? And going back to the interviews, what I think would have been very interesting would be some information in the paper about how these companies, these specific companies that the interviewees talk about, how they were configured, right? I know Australia and the US are relatively similar in that sense in terms of ownership structure, but it still would be good to know some detail about the companies we understand better where the answers come from. And that, of course, makes it would help us to generalize from the paper and from the answers to other countries, to other jurisdictions that may have different circumstances. We could talk about possible gains and losses that particular types of stakeholders and shareholders have from moving to a more climate change oriented approach, and the same would be true for employees and other stakeholder groups. And each group, of course, each individual shareholder in a particular jurisdiction might be subject to different social pressures to perform in a certain way, to send a particular message out there when whether you want to send a signal to the public, whether you're sort of climate conscious or not, right? And so it's not just about profits and gains, but also if you're an institutional investor that needs to market their products to millennials, for example, which has been discussed in recent years. For employees, one might ask the question of not only what is their bargaining power, but if we could ask the question, how much impact, how much income are you willing to give up for a job with a climate-friendly firm? And sort of analogous to the question whether it's necessary to give up returns for investing in ESG, sort of in ESG conscious investments. So the fiduciary duty in the discussion of the paper is really interesting. And I think as corporate law scholars, we can probably agree that, they might not take us very far in the United States because for various reasons that Brett has outlined very, very well. I think one thing that the paper talks about is that it argues that other jurisdictions, fiduciary lawsuits, including in Australia, might be more likely. And the question I would ask is the US also has a relatively good set of substantive protections for directors from lawsuits. On the other hand, they also have, the United States also has the most litigious culture across countries for various reasons that are well understood in the comparative corporate governance literature. And other countries that may, in theory, seem to have stronger substantive possibilities for lawsuits probably have very few lawsuits because litigation is not configured for it to work out that way. So that is also a question that I think would be interesting to look at more. Finally, I think the paper is maybe not as explicit as it could be about the underlying trade-off, although Brett has really sort of highlighted in the presentation. It's really, I think, about we need corporate law because regulatory law isn't going anywhere for political reasons. It reminds me, of course, of Milton Friedman again, because this is exactly what you criticize. If you can't get your political goals implemented, you have to go through corporate law. But of course, it would be great to see some discussion of the trade-off. So that's it for me. This is a very thought-provoking paper. I really enjoyed reading it. There are a couple of issues that where I think one could raise sort of a few additional questions. The paper is almost published, and it's very long already. So maybe that's an issue we can. These are issues we could discuss, and that that might be food for the next paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Brad, do you want to say anything in response to what Martin has said? Yes.
If you don't mind, if I could just say a few words, because that was really helpful and interesting. And even though this paper is done, other work that I and the others are doing, it will be very helpful. So let me just say a few words. First, I totally agree with you on the question of the difference of alignment among different stakeholders, and it's something in other work I'm very concerned with. I agree with you that in terms of board representation, especially elected representation, there's a difference between insider stakeholders, above all employees, and other kinds of stakeholders. And actually my biggest thing in corporate law is employee representation. That's what actually drew me to corporate law. It's very lonely in the United States with that position. And you are right. Sometimes employees aren't going to be pro-environment, right? If you're dealing with a coal company, a monoline coal company, those employees are probably not going to be all that interested in improving climate change when it means the end of their jobs. I do think in many companies, employees do seem to be quite interested in this. It is one of the reasons that many businesses are giving for why we're moving in this area, is because our employees want it, and we're attracting the employees, especially as you're attracting millennials, right? Younger employees. So I do think in many companies, a greater empowerment of employees would tend to be helpful for the environment. They would tend to push in that direction, but it's certainly not always true. There are definitely trade-offs. You're absolutely right there. That links to another question where, again, you're right. There's this question of is a move to a stakeholder emphasis does it give too much more or less discretion to managers, and is that a good or a bad thing? What I'm looking for, again, with that employee emphasis is trying to make it a move towards stakeholders with some bite to that. So there is some limiting to management discretion going on there, but I do think that's hard. And it's not necessarily what's going on right now. The business roundtable move to stakeholderism, that's more management discretion. That's not necessarily what I am looking for. Beyond employees on the board, or some greater other ways of empowering employees, which I'm working on again in other papers. On the environment side, you're not going to have environmental directors being elected by outside stakeholders. That's not going to happen. I do think advisory councils are more the way to go if you want robust a stakeholder voice. You could, if you had councils like that in play, have them suggest potential director nominees to the board. So things like ExxonMobil, where you're bringing, for companies where it's relevant, environmental expertise is relevant. If you had a sort of outsider stakeholder council, that would be sort of systematic way of trying to get advice on good directors with that kind of expertise. And the last thing I'll say, two last things to say. One, your point on fiduciary duty. So you're totally right on that, Martin. One thing that has puzzled me throughout this, and this has been a tension between me and my co-authors throughout this, is I'm saying, look, these suits are hopeless in Delaware. They're slightly less hopeless now because of a few recent Caremark cases, but they're basically hopeless in Delaware. And my sense has always been the same as yours, Martin's. We're the most litigious country of all in this area. How can this possibly work elsewhere? But my co-authors keep telling me, but look, we're talking about in Australia, that we're talking about in Europe. They're involved with some of the organizations that are thinking of bringing these. And there does seem to be some sense that these might prevail. Otherwise, Sarah Barker, I think, will be on the panel next. I'm interested in what she has to say about. I am puzzled by that. I don't understand it. It doesn't fit with my sense going into this thing. So I'm a bit puzzled by that as well. And finally, on the question of the trade-off between corporate law and environmental law, you're right. We fudged that a bit, and partly that's because there's 4 authors. And I've been the pessimist about corporate and securities law throughout all of this, not just on duty, but everything. My role has been, you know what? You really like that to work. You want that to work. You're seeing all of the stuff you focus on isn't working. Maybe this is something that will. And my role has all along been, I don't think that's going to go very far. And so what you have is a bit of a compromise between those positions in the final paper.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks. We have a lot of interesting questions actually in the chat, but I can only pick a few. So I'm inviting Claire Hill to verbalize her question. Claire?
Okay, hi, Brett.
Hi, Claire.
And behind me,
former frequent co-authors.
And behind me is Anna the cat, in case her head pops up. There.
Hi, Anna.
So this picks up on some of the stuff I was asking and some of the stuff that Jill was raising also in the chat, which is, I mean, I remember a bit about the history of when this stuff was much more kind of touchy-feely, and there was a sense, you know, the hard profit maximization versus like the contingent valuation literature, where everybody wanted to throw millions of dollars at saving one forest, one tree, one brook. So it was completely how you would move forward, how you would decide what you were doing, what resources to throw. The people who were in the business of trying to push companies in that way were they just wanted more good stuff. And it was totally impossible to operationalize. Question I guess I have here is, here we've identified a variety of pressures, competitive pressures to say I'm doing this stuff, even if it's somewhat greenwashing. We've identified different kinds of standards to say whether you're doing things. We've identified that different stakeholders have different views. So the question is, on balance, is the pressure to do something now good? Presumably yes, but if so, how do we maximize that? And given the competing stakeholders, given the competitive pressures to be saying you're doing something, given that people are going to be sort of up in arms and that the pressure is not going to be necessarily thrown at doing something kind of defensible, rigorous, etc. How do we translate sort of good sentiments, so to speak, into action that makes sense, taking seriously Jill's point that there's no consensus as to good, and even if there were, it would be different consensi among different stakeholder and shareholder groups and governmental groups and customer groups and so on.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there's not a lot of time to answer it, but I mean, I do think that insofar as one can tell a story, even within a long-term shareholder value perspective on why all of this might be a difference, a lot of it does come down to all the effort that's being done to come up with some kind of measurement and disclosure is helpful. It's giving a way of sort of coming up with common measures, common language. They're imperfect, they're highly imperfect, but there is something, and it does give a way of both conveying to external constituencies as you get more disclosure, here's what's going on. And one, of course, the benefits of disclosure in response to your and Jill's issue. I haven't had a chance to read all the comments yet. I'm hoping I'll get it. It's hard to do that while you're presenting. So I'm looking forward to reading them afterwards. But one of the benefits of disclosure, of course, is that, look, if different people have different valuations of how this all matters, well, you put the disclosure out there and people that can decide, oh, I want to be with a climate change friendly company. No, you know what? I think climate change, that's all PC woke nonsense. I'm going to work for this company that isn't doing anything on climate change. Disclosure, you know, has some of that benefit. So I do think that the move to sort of a common disclosure language, there's lots of imperfections in that disclosure. It's not going to be as good as objective as financial disclosure. It's more squishy, but it's still worthwhile. And I do think, you know, there's this tension, and I've had this tension between let 1,000 flowers bloom in disclosure and have various private initiatives as a way of trying to get at what should best disclosure look like. And I've been a little wary about the SEC stepping in and formalizing it. And I'm still wary about that. One thing I came away from all of this is that this process is creating a lot of confusion. I mean, there's a lot of useful ideas being generated, but there's also a lot of confusion. I think there is now a role for the SEC coming in and pointing to one of the standards that's emerged, maybe SASB in the US, though elsewhere it might be different, and that's an issue. Saying we're going to use this, but we're still going to have, SASB will do a lot of the development of that. I don't want the SEC to completely stop that evolutionary process, but I do think there's a role there. The other part of it, I didn't talk much about this in the talk, is there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and more than I go in the paper. I'm working on this and other stuff now on how companies do this internally, how they involve stakeholders internally, and how they, at the board level and at the sort of lower level officer and employee level, how this information is being generated and then being used in the company. And there's sort of tough trade-offs there between like having people who are committees or officer positions or departments that are focused specifically on environment versus sort of a more diffuse model. It's sort of like how we treat professional responsibility. Do you do it in a separate course or do you do it diffusely? And there's some benefits to each. The silo approach has a problem. That information doesn't get to the people who really have power. But on the other hand, if it's diffuse, no one has responsibility. So exactly how, I think there are a lot of interesting questions on how you do that. I don't think that regulation has a lot to do with that, but I think there's a sort of developing process going on there that's interesting and important and related to your ALI compliance stuff, by the way, as to what's the best way. Should there be a separate committee on the board, or should it be part of the governance committee that deals with this? Should there be CSO, what kind of executive positions should be dealing with that? I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there that I'm continuing to work on in other work.
Yes, thanks, Brad. Yes.